So here we go. Welcome back to another episode of Off Script with Expel. I'm Tina Velez, as always joined by my wonderful and illustrious host, John Henzinski. And today we have a very special guest. And that very special guest is Paul Melson from Target. And Paul, I know this is not the music podcast we've talked about doing for years, but we really appreciate you taking the time to share your stories with us and with our audience. So with that in mind, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are and what you do now?
Yeah, awesome. Thank you so much for having me. So a little about me. I'm Paul Melson. I'm vice president with the cybersecurity team at Target. On background, 27 years in tech, 21 of that in cybersecurity, and for the last 15 years of my career, I've been in. I've had the privilege to serve in some sort of leadership capacity of one kind or another. So. I live in Minneapolis with my family and our two dogs, Scarlett and Toby.
And they're not going to make an appearance today, huh?
There's a non-zero chance. This is not a virtual background, so you very well see them run by the door while we're talking today. It's possible.
I love it. Paul, can you tell us a little bit more about like the role you're in now? Like, it sounds like a pretty big role for a pretty big company that people are probably very familiar with. Like, tell us a little bit about the role you're in now, and like, talk to us a little bit about like a typical day and the types of problems that you're solving.
Sure. So, I have the privilege of leading what is a fairly large and diverse set of cybersecurity teams around the globe, and we work on kind of all things from like authentication, authorization, perimeter and endpoint security, cryptography, and secrets management, and all of the teams that are involved in securing Target's internally developed software. So, broad set of kind of talent that I get to work with and problems that I get to work on. I think probably the most sort of topical and relatable thing that I've worked on, especially over the last year. The last few weeks in December of 2021 were kind of a scramble to manage and respond to and mitigate Log4j, and then a good chunk of time in 2022 really spent trying to learn the lessons from that on software supply chain and that set of problems. So it's been a fun ride, trying to do something like that at scale. And what we discovered really is, software supply chain and kind of vulnerability management at that level. Because Log4j is really interesting, right? One, because it's sort of a once in a lifetime. I don't want to say once in a lifetime because it probably happened already 3 or 4 times in my career. But the number of times that you get this vulnerability that's based on one, this library that's just in everything, because a decade or so ago, Apache decided every log handler would use Log4j for anything, whether it wrote to a file, standard out, whatever, would be based on this. So Log4j is in everything. We've seen it across, Windows, Mac, Linux, non-Linux, Unix, embedded systems, proprietary, commercial, x86, x64, ARM. It's in everything. And so it was an interesting set of challenges, because you're trying to where are all the perspectives you have in GitHub repositories and Subversion repositories, file systems running in memory, dependency mappings, listening services, and then trying to bring all of that data from all those different mechanisms for getting each of those individual vantage points, bringing that data together, and really being able to kind of catalog and understand that placement back out in the in the environment. So how do you quickly, if you have to triage a vulnerability like that again in the future, how do you handle, identify, and respond to all those systems? So it's been a good ride. We learned a lot, and it's been an interesting problem to kind of work on. So talking about software supply chain for a while in terms of poison pill and that kind of thing, but what happens when you just have this thing that is in all of your projects, even though nobody decided they wanted it in the project? It just came from a dependency from a component, right? Yeah. So it's been so that's an example of the kind of stuff that I get to work on.
I want to take just a step back really quickly. I don't want to dive too deep, but you made a comment regarding learning the lessons specifically as it relates to software supply chain. Like, you described it quite well. You've got this vulnerability that lives in almost everything that these applications are touching across your organization everywhere. is there like a TLDR or like a bottom line up front of some of the key lessons you learned going through that you can share with our audience? I'd be super interested in hearing about that.
One is, so what does it look like to understand the software as it's, once it's running in the environment, however it got there? And then the other piece is really understanding what are all the ways that software enters your environment, and how are you handling that? And I'll say that was an eye opener, right? Because you end up in situations where your software supply chain isn't as linear as you necessarily think. Even in organizations like Target, where there's really good discipline around Artifactory, GitHub Enterprise, those kinds of tool sets that you would expect, there's still a variety of different ways that software enters the environment. And of course, I think the other lesson learned, I would say, is the false dichotomy of open source software versus commercial software. Because Log4j, honestly, the in-house developed applications, their remediation time and the responsiveness and their ability both to deploy mitigations within that kind of first 72 hours, but then also kind of the cleanup of those code bases after the fact, and getting the stable and supported patched versions of Log4j2 into the environment. That happened a whole lot more quickly on the open source side, really, than it did on the commercial side. Even though, and I think that was another piece that we had sort of assumed was your software supply chain really is all about open source, and it's not, right? And what you think might be closed source is probably a lot of open source under the hood. So this was a good reminder of that as well, I think. But yeah, and there's some cool things that happened in there too, right? Once we started looking at this as kind of a data problem, right? In order to sort of identify, prioritize, and communicate required actions. Once we started looking at it that way, the other thing that we sort of lived with things like scanning as a key piece of like vulnerability management and asset inventory, and it definitely still has a play. But once you start looking at software in terms of a life cycle of written code on an endpoint, in a repository, into a test environment, or a local VM, and then eventually into a performance environment, and then live into a production environment. Like, if you think about all of the ways that software kind of moves at each of those steps, you also realize that's an opportunity to collect on that. And if you start thinking about what do we want to be intentional about gathering at what point in time so that we have this information, all of a sudden things like, depending on file system scanning and interacting with package managers and the rest of that, right? But if you're doing a full collect on your builds and dependencies, and setting that data into like, say, a data lake with a search capability, well, now all of a sudden scans that used to take a few days to run across a large environment that can come back as a search now in a matter of minutes, right? So there's some interesting opportunities for innovation when we start thinking about it.
Paul, I'm hoping you're not jinxing us here with regards to Black Swan events. Like, Log4j, absolutely significant. I feel like on the Defender side in the last few years, we've had a number of opportunities to have to really flex and learn and adapt around some pretty significant type of events. Given where you sit now, and I think this is kind of what we really want to convey to the audience, like, you just rattled off a lot of stuff that shows domain expertise and understanding around everything related to pretty much every aspect of what a functioning enterprise environment requires, right? How did you get to that point? Like, you have expertise. I would say for someone to call you a generalist, I think would be really silly. Like, you have a level of depth and understanding in certain things within security. And I think it would be really beneficial. Like, you spend a lot of time now in meetings doing the business stuff, being the VP person. But I think our audience would really like to hear, like, how you got there. Like, how did you build up these skill sets? How did you learn around these specific domains? Like, what got you to that point?
It's a good question, and it's a really long answer. That I'll try and keep short, which is not one of my strong suits, but I'll do my best. I'm part of that kind of Gen X class that came into cybersecurity like at the ground floor, right? I started working in tech in the mid '90s, and had some kind of affinity for it. I got my first computer when I was in junior high. We got a real PC when I was in high school. It had a modem on it, and from there I got into BBSing and found the internet and got it. So I got interested in kind of all things technology, and eventually, because I was a broke high school student who really liked playing games, I also stumbled as one does into kind of the the hacking community and zines and some of that, and that just sort of kind of stuck with me. I out of high school went and started a computer science degree, but I couldn't shake the value of like the connected system, right? Like I think that was. I remember sitting in class as a college sophomore and thinking like I'm learning how to write applications in one language to run on a single system. But the future is all of these systems are all going to talk to each other. Everything's going to be managed remotely. Data is going to move, around the globe in minutes, and everything is going to work like that in the future. And I found myself honestly a little bored. So ended up, I'll say withdrawing. I dropped out, but then I went back and got a degree. So I'm not a college dropout anymore, but I was for a few years. Got a job just doing PC and printer repair at a school district, and they supported kind of my ongoing education, and so in 18 months after starting there, I wound up passing my Novell C&E. They then the system administrator, network admin, and worked on a variety of different systems there for several years, and that was a lot of fun. Novell, NT, Unix, all kinds of different weird networking protocols because we had an AS400 from the 80s, and so I spent the 90s learning stuff that doesn't exist anymore. But and then in manufacturing for a while, in automotive, and then in 2001, a friend of mine that I had worked with at the school district called me. He had left the school district around the same time. Went into consulting, called me up and said, "Hey, we're starting a security practice. Are you interested?" And I don't remember anything that was like the first 30 seconds of the conversation. I don't remember anything. I assume I just shouted yes over and over again until he was like, "Calm down, and why don't we go meet for lunch, and you can meet the practice manager." And I dove in with both feet, and that was like boot camp for me, getting to do security and consulting like full time. I learned so much, so many different environments, so many different pieces of technology, so many different problems. And I think that's where kind of the depth of that came in. But I had always kind of had that interest, so it was a natural fit, and that sort of got me going. And I think the other thing for me though too is, I'm somebody who I love a mystery, and I love puzzles, and cybersecurity is those things, in spades. It's some really hard problems without obvious solutions. You can't just go look up the answer to everything you want to learn in a book. So it is a lot of just kind of trial and error and following your intuition, and kind of that's ultimately how I got into it. And while I was consulting, I went back to school and finished a degree in business. Yeah, I guess that's sort of the path. And then for anybody that knows me outside of work, right? Like this is still what I do outside of work. People are like, do you have hobbies? And I'm like, well, I play the drums poorly, but my big hobby is I also still do security on the side.
I love it. Are you running like a Novell network at home for fun? Just out of curiosity.
No, but there's a full NSM sensor and SIM.
I love it
here to my left. So so shout out to Doug and Phil and Mike and the Security Onion team. I run Security Onion at home, but no, my big side project is I run a series of scrapers that look for malware staged on kind of open sites, S3 storage, paste sites, things like that, and then that to Twitter.
Yeah, I want to take a step back really quickly and just tap on something a bit. You said a comment. You said the value of a connected system. You're like, okay, you see that. tell us a little bit more. Like, what is that value? That's pretty deep. And, you know, we're trying to go deep here, Paul. Like, what is the value of a connected system? Let's get through.
Yeah, no, I remember I very clearly had like this kind of, you know, clouds parting, sun shining through moment in my, you know, in my high school years. And this is a true story. It's absolutely happened. You know, when I kind of found the internet, it was a friend of mine, you know, kind of pointed me at it and said, you know, I know you're into BBSing, but have you checked this out? And it was like going from your neighborhood and being all of a sudden able to see the entire universe. It was this, you know, this like boundless expanse, right? To just sort of let my curiosity run wild. And then eventually kind of finding people that, you know, felt and thought the same way. So one, it was just, you know, it was all of the all of the interesting stuff that I could want, and a bunch I didn't know that I would want to learn about and mess around with and try. And then, you know, finding other people that felt the same way, because there were, you know, a handful of people that I knew in, you know, kind of my hometown growing up that were into that, but then realizing, you know, there's thousands of people out there. And what's wild is, you know, some of those same people that, you know, you met in like IRC chat rooms or, you know, 2600 meetups, you know, went on to, you know, found companies and, you know, like, you know, household names in security came out of that same.
I love it.
It's a moment, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, we live in you know, kind of a world where we interact with employees over Zoom technology and meet them in person. When you met up with those folks that you first met on the BBS, was it similar to like meeting a person today that you've only known over Zoom? Like, oh my God, you're a real person. What were those introductions like?
Yeah, but it was way worse because you had no idea what anybody looked like. So one, you had the awkward, like, you know, walking up to a stranger and trying to call them by, you know, some weird pseudonym that, you know, like,
are you hacker 456
handle that they used online, right? Yeah, totally. So that was weird to begin with. And then, you know, and nobody's, you know, that was the fascinating thing, right? Like now today you meet people on the internet and exactly, right? Zoom, FaceTime, you know, whatever the tech is, you can get a good sense of who that person is. You can recognize them. We all post pictures online and the rest of that. And, you know, that was, you know, 25 years ago was rare, if at all, a thing that happened. So you're meeting people and, you know, everybody's kind of blowing your mind in terms of like, wow, you know, I had painted this mental picture of you this way and you're, you look and sound very different. You dress very different. You know, I thought everybody was sort of, you know, everybody who was in the scene at the time was going to be more kind of, you know, punky, alternative, kind of like me and my friends were, and you know, a lot of them weren't.
I was going to ask, did 1995 Paul have long hair? What were we rocking back then? Like talking.
Yeah, no, true story. 1995 Paul had long hair with an undercut. That's true story. I don't have any pictures handy of that look. I know some exist. But.
Well, note to our producers, we'll have to like, you know, cut to 1995 Paul, right? We will definitely.
I owe the producers a headshot. I don't think that will be it though.
Are you sure? I mean, if you want.
I think we should.
Paul, there's something that you said that is very much a recurring theme in the conversations we've had with our other guests. It seems like we all love solving puzzles, and not all of us did very well in traditional academic settings, especially when it came to computer science. I think that that's a fascinating call out, given how much the space has advanced from a kind of cybersecurity as a degree track, right? Like the idea that we have so much of this investment from the academic side in the field, and there's still this giant disconnect with what those people are learning when they leave. It's like you have book smarts, but you haven't really figured out what this looks like in practice. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Two things, right? One is that I do think that that's changing, and very much for the better. And I think about the experiences that I had, you know, in the 90s when I was, you know, in high school and college and early in my career. before information security was really even a job option, right? When I started, security was passwords, firewalls, and patching. And in a lot of cases, patching meant downloading source, compiling it, and installing it by copying files around. It's things have progressed a lot since then, but security's also gotten much more kind of complicated and involved. And the thing I'll say about security too, and this is why the educational opportunities for cybersecurity continue to improve, right? Like you don't have to go find shady characters on the internet to learn about cybersecurity now, right? Like there's all kinds of free courses and capture the flags and right, like Hack Me Bank and all of those sorts of things that are out there that you can experiment with and learn in a home lab, using virtualization software on a laptop. It's so much. So I would have loved when I was like 17, 18, 19 to have had access to those resources then that are available. But I think it's, but you are seeing, right, that college education catch up. But there's sort of two problems. And I think everybody who's a CS major, whether they want to get into cybersecurity or just tech in general, has to come to terms with. And one is that, kind of tech and knowledge cycles, right? There are things that have long tails, but most of your patterns and knowledge cycles run in about a 3 to 5 year sprint. So the good news, right, is that if you want to get into the field, 3 years is I think a reasonable amount of time for hands-on learning to be proficient and productive, even if you are starting from almost nothing. Just some. But that also means for all of us that are in the field, right? You're committed to to continuous learning to stay relevant. Like I was talking about earlier, right? I'm 21. I had my Novell Master C&E and GroupWise. And I thought, boom, done, I've made it. I'm saying words now that most of the people will have one of two reactions to. Most people will be like, I don't know what that is. And that's fine. That's probably for the best. And the people who do be like, oof, yikes. And that was a long time ago. And that's just how it works, right? Like that'll happen to the things that I'm working on now before I retire. I think that's part of it. I think and then I think the other piece of it is cybersecurity is such a challenging field because it's not, if you think of tech in terms of verticals, right? Like networking, SQL databases and data lakes, software development for front end, software development for services and APIs and back end. System administration and operating systems in Unix, Active Directory in Windows, right? If you think of all those things in verticals, every single one of those has a security component to it, right? So I always like to talk about security as being a horizontal because it cuts across all those things. But the reality of the situation is that in most of those verticals, the level of depth that you can go from a security perspective, both in terms of finding problems and resolving problems, but also instrumenting, defending, auditing, all of those things that you have to do to support good security in an environment. The level of depth is almost the same as that particular. To come out of a 4-year bachelor's in computer science with a cybersecurity specialty as an expert. I think what you are is initiated. I think what you are is exposed. You have familiarity to the concepts, and you know how to approach technology and problems. But and I think for me personally, I think that's why cybersecurity has been such a great career and why I've been doing it for 21 years straight. Is it doesn't ever get boring, right? The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know about what there is to know. So the ground always moves under your feet a little bit. That's something that took a little while, early in my career to get comfortable with. But then once I did, there was sort of a bit of confidence that comes with that knowledge, right? That like, I might not be the expert at this thing today, but give me enough time, and one, I can be, and two, it also won't matter that much.
I love that. Yeah. Like a big part about my own personal journey is getting comfortable and confident and realizing it's okay to admit that you don't know, and knowing like, oh, I could totally learn that, just like I learned all of these other concepts pretty quickly. So love that. Paul, I kind of want to kind of go back in time a little bit, right? 21-year-old Paul, 1995, maybe you're trying to find, people to connect with on BBSs or what have you. But one of the things that we like to do is a big part of this webcast or this series is imparting wisdom on our audience. And so really, if you could kind of go back in time and, give yourself some advice, give some advice to 1995 Paul, or your past self, like what 3 lessons or learnings would you tell your past self?
My big lesson was just getting to a place where I got really comfortable kind of owning my mistakes and learning from them, right? Sort of developing that like personal and professional integrity, and realizing that if I was going to have any sort of, meaningful career, and that especially on my own terms, then that meant having that level of account, self accountability, and really learning, like, not just avoiding mistakes or thinking of them as failures, right, but leaning into them. And so both relationally with people I worked with, and in particular people I worked for, being that person who would, like, bring it forward and say, this is what happened, this is the mistake I made, this is what I'm going to do to resolve it. Do you have input? What would anything you want me to handle differently? And realizing how quickly that kind of grew people's trust and their willingness to give me more responsibility and count on me for more things, which is a key piece. And then the other piece of that is just that that personal integrity piece is so important in cybersecurity, right? You're in an environment from a cybersecurity perspective as a professional where, one, you might have some, especially if it's offensive security, or even if you're just, right, like all the things, or how to manipulate and attack systems. So if at any point you act with anything less than kind of the highest integrity, right, it's worse than just anybody acting it's particularly dangerous and damning. I have some. I'm happy to say I don't have any stories about myself ending up in that situation, but I've had to be on the other side of the table from folks that have had some lapses in judgment. Once you kind of breach that trust, it's really, really hard to come back from that. So that was a thing that I wish I had learned earlier in my career. It took me into probably my late 20s before I kind of really figured that out. What owning my mistakes and being accountable meant, and why it was so important. That's probably number one lesson. I think the other advice I would have had for me back then, don't be afraid to try new things for fear of failure. Sort of ties into that first one. I think the things that have scared me the most really have turned out to be the most fun and rewarding. The big leaps are usually where the big change happens, and that's something I wish I had leaned into in a couple of instances that I didn't. But all the times that I was like, this is terrifying, I don't know if I should do this, but here we go, right, over the edge, and not that there isn't some pain that comes with some of those changes. And finally, and I say this to anybody and everybody who will listen, right, this cybersecurity is a big area of study, but the field, meaning the professionals that actually do this stuff, is still pretty small. And you're going to run into the same folks over and over again. So, one, take the time to build that network, right? Get to know people, build relationships. And then two, always be kind. You don't have to agree with everybody. You don't have to like working with everybody. That isn't what I mean. But, be kind, be fair, because, chances are that, you're going to come back around. And honestly, from a career perspective, that can be a great thing. The way I wound up, at Target, the role I'm in, the person that recruited me to Target was somebody I had met a full decade before I came to work at Target. That's just how it works.
I love it. I'm going to replay back one thing you said is when you talk about not being afraid to kind of take chances. The way I think about that is we grow through what we go through, and the ability to grow is correlated to the things that you go through, whether that be that new thing or that challenge or risk. And so I think about that in networking. And I think what you're saying is be a good human. Like, it's not that hard. Just be a good person.
It's not. Don't be a jerk.
Yeah. It isn't that hard. Yet on more than one occasion have had to give that advice in a pointed manner. But it really is solid advice, I think, for for anybody on their professional journey, but especially in cybersecurity. You're going to see the same folks over and over again. Especially if you want to get into especially if where you want to spend time is defense. The pool of defenders right now is still pretty small. It's growing, but it's still pretty small. And to see those folks again. But having said that, right? I mean, there's probably some of the strongest bonds I have professionally are the folks that have been in the trenches during big incidents, right? There is a bonding that happens from going through the suck that is a big IR. Those moments will create lasting bonds, lasting friendships.
You're here. Yeah, I could not agree more. And sometimes it's not even that large incident response. It could be, oh, we're in the SOC on Saturday morning, Sunday night, and we're just here together. There's some of that too. Some of us have been there. I know what it's like. That camaraderie is very real. It's something that keeps me very close to security operations, even at this point in my career.
Yeah, absolutely.
Paul, there's something that you mentioned kind of in those lessons for your past self. The one about not being afraid to try new things. Thinking about moving from a more hands-on kind of just day-to-day function to real business level kind of conversations, like talk us through that transition. Was that a challenge for you? Do you feel like there's a disconnect, a knowledge gap because you're no longer as much of a practitioner as you once were?
Yeah. So a couple of things on that. So talking a little bit about my own journey in transitioning from being a hands-on engineer, and at the time that I transitioned into leadership, I was doing primarily defensive work, right? So SIM and IDS rules and incident response at the company that I moved into leadership in. And that story is a fun one because I had no real designs. I didn't have an active ambition. I had sort of mused about like, oh gosh, what would leadership look like? Would I want it someday? I don't know, but had no plans. What ended up happening was I worked on it was a relatively small security team. My boss at the time, great guy, I'm going to shout him out if you don't mind, Tim Miletic, who I got a chance to work with at Priority Health. And then also we got to work together at Target for a little while. Just a great guy and somebody who, was pivotal in my learning and my career. But he wanted to refocus on doing technical work himself, and went to his boss at the time and asked her if he could transition back into kind of like a lead engineer role. And she said, that's fine, but who's going to run the team? And he's like, Paul can do it. We hadn't talked about it, those words to her. So I got approached at the end of the week, and she was like, what do you think? And I was like, I need the weekend to think about it, and I took the time and team. I liked everybody on the team. We were relatively agile and high performing, and I just thought to myself, here's an opportunity to do this where I don't think this is my best shot at a successful transition into leadership, and it may not, I may not get another shot for a while. So. Okay, sure. I'll take a swing. And knowing that I had Tim's support was huge too, right? He was going to stay on the team, and that was sort of a powerful signal, and that, yeah, and it was a lot of fun, and I found kind of new sets of rewards that come with. talk about the business piece of it, which is, so there's really three things, right? So you have the security acumen, which can be technical, or it doesn't even necessarily have to be technical expertise, right? But like knowing, regulatory or risk framework, or, standard working procedures, for working with auditors, things like that, right? Like there's a bunch of different like subject matter expertise space within cybersecurity. And the second thing is really just the leadership skills, and technical skills and leadership skills aren't mutually exclusive. And I have run into that multiple times over the course of my career, where people sort of equate, if you're technical, then you can't lead, and if you lead, then you can't be. It's good, that comparison is the same as saying like, well, if you cook, you can't be good at basketball. Like, well, if you spend all of your time in the kitchen, you're not going to get any better at basketball. And if you spend all your time on the court, you're not going to get any better at cooking. But you can be good at both of those things if you put the time and balance into it and you're intentional about it. And that's a thing that I've worked on for a while, right? Is trying to keep technical outlets close to me so that I can still have some of those skills at hand. And then the third part of that, though, is that business acumen piece. And you really, I think everybody should, if they're moving into leadership, I think you should spend some time with, what the CEO wants you to know, or, there's a few other good books out there that are just sort of Cliff Notes MBA type books. It's good to understand, how your company makes money, the difference between top line and bottom line, revenue and profit, and understanding, how your company runs, how they make money, what their brand commitment and promises are. What is, and only because security's job really is to, we're a loss avoidance function, right? Our job is to keep the bad thing from happening, right? We're cheaper than the really negative outcome that you could have if you have poor security. So we're really there to enable those functions, but understanding, which things are critical and which things are important, enables you to have mature conversations around security trade-offs and investment and the rest of that. So I think to make that transition, you kind of have to be willing to spend time on. So it's funny because we talk about training and training investment with the cybersecurity team at Target quite a bit. And one of the things that I end up working on with new leaders is, hey, I don't think you need to take another SANS course. I don't think you need, to go learn this technical skill, but you might benefit from, management course or a course on, kind of business accounting, understand some of these things that you're now going to have to come in contact with, so that you've got, something to fall back on instead of kind of learning it cold, or having to learn through trial and error, which error is one thing when it's technical and in a lab, but when you're doing it with other people's careers or other people's money, less of a good idea. So I'm a big fan of treating all three of those as
say louder for the people in the back that we are cheaper. A well-funded security program is going to be cheaper than the ramifications of when an event actually happens. And conveying that, like you said, being able to have mature conversations at that business level, like that is something that I wish more people really thought about. That we need to see more people who have both the technical and business acumen to be able to get into those positions to drive these conversations forward. Because it becomes very easy to get bogged down in just a technical skill set and controls. And if you can't convey that properly, explain like I'm five to leadership, you've already lost. So thank you very much for calling that out. I would love to see more folks that have any kind of inclination in getting into leadership roles, really focusing on things like good communication, good writing, and being able to take all of these concepts and really, I'm not saying dumb them down, but make it very clear as to what they are, how they impact the business, and how they enable the business to keep moving forward. John, I'm sorry. I think you're about to say something.
No, I was just going to bring a little comedy here. I was just going to say, Paul, in this context, is the technical acumen the cooking, in the business is the basketball, or like how do you think about that?
Yeah, hard to. I don't know. Ironically, I'm not particularly good at cooking.
Go on. Paul's out there dunking and cooking, chicken parmesan. I love it.
I know, it was like a super specific example, like cooking and basketball. Like, okay, man, sure, that's fine. But Paul, I want to take us in a totally different direction and something a little more, some people might think it's silly, but I think it's fascinating. If you had the opportunity to time travel for one show and one show only, what would it be? And I'm hoping this is super obscure.
Well, I don't know if it's obscure. It's super specific, though, right? Like I have an answer for that question. That's not just, oh, I'd love to. So there's a show that I almost went to and didn't go to, in 1993, Nirvana and the Meat Puppets played Wing Stadium in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and I lived not far away from there at the time. Some friends of mine went to the show. A friend of mine had a ticket. I wasn't able to go, and I never did get to see Nirvana perform live. So that's a bucket list moment for me that right, it would just never get realized. So yeah, if you gave me a time machine, that I'd go back and take whatever the consequence was from my mom at the time. I'd have gone to Kalamazoo for that show for sure.
That was the In Utero tour, right? Like that was the last tour he did. Yeah, that's what I thought.
The last American tour, yeah.
Because I think in Asia, he had some shows in Japan, possibly with Sonic Youth around that time, maybe.
Yeah, and I'm not the Nirvana history expert. I thought Rome was kind of where it came to a head, and because they ended up canceling that tour and coming home early. I remember that because that was like, so that show was in the fall, and then I was on spring break, sitting at home watching MTV News when that news broke. So
it was Kurt Loder's like moment in the sun, for better or for worse. Like that is a generational moment that I think a lot of us remember when he made that announcement. And it
is. It's definitely a touch point.
Well, Paul, our audience and probably at this point the Nirvana fan club would love to know how they can connect with you. So where can folks find you?
Yeah, sure. I'm P. Melson on pretty much every platform. So you can find me on Mastodon at InfoSec Exchange at P. Melson, on Twitter at P. Melson, and on LinkedIn at /in/P. Melson, on GitHub at P. Melson. So that's probably the best way to find me. Is just search P. Melson.
P. Melson. P. Melson. Again, Paul, thank you so much for joining. I've been a huge fan of your Twitter account for a long time, so it's so very cool to meet you in person. So, Paul, thanks again for sharing your story, and thank you all for watching. Please don't forget to register for our upcoming episodes, and see you all soon. Thank you very much. Insert wave now.
Bye.
Bye.